We have the traditional development assistance, but we also have one important element that is really taking up a lot of my time at the moment, and that is to leverage private funding and private investments. And so one of my priorities is to see how can we use some of that ODA money, some of that traditional development assistance money, but taking off some of the risks for private sector to enter into markets where they haven't been before. And we see, there are huge opportunities and so many things that we can do with limited public funding, but that can leverage so much private initiative.
Minister Tvinnereim, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be here.
All right. Now, we have an excellent discussion lined up. We want to talk about development policy, Norway's development policy towards Africa, and how that development policy is evolving in the context of this sort of rapid and profound change that we're seeing globally. We all know that the world is changing and that rate of change is accelerating. And in that context, there is a growing emphasis, or there's growing discussion about the importance of Africa and the growing importance of Africa in what many are calling an emerging multipolar world order, which is very sort of like ripe material for a fascinating discussion about what this means for Norwegian policy towards Africa, development policy on the continent, and so on. And these are some of the issues we want to unpack. Anyway, that's all from me for now by way of an introduction. To start off the conversation, Minister, could you perhaps, for those who are not familiar, just give us a bit of a summary of what the core aspects of Norway's development policy are, specifically when it comes to engagement with Africa?
Thank you, Laura. Well, Africa is very much the focus of Norwegian development assistance priorities. It has been for decades. Norway we're a small country, but we do have quite substantial budget for development assistance. And in terms of the current government that I represent, we have some priority issues. Climate finance is one of them. So climate, investing in both adaptation and mitigation, especially looking at renewable energy. Global health is an important priority. Food security and investments in the long value chains on agriculture and fisheries is an important element as well. And of course, we work across there are many dimensions in development policies. One is capacity building, technology transfer. We have many interesting programs where we share expertise from our public sector, from the ministries, for example, in terms of strengthening institutions in African countries. We have the traditional development assistance, but we also have one important element that is really taking up a lot of my time at the moment, and that is to leverage private funding and private investments. Because what I and all my colleagues in other countries, like-minded countries, are struggling with right now is that investments in development is really, there's a financial struggle every day, and there are more and more huge problems to solve and to tackle: climate, conflict, humanitarian hotspots, while the financial space is shrinking. So what we need is to get all hands on deck. And so one of my priorities is to see how can we use some of that ODA money, some of that traditional development assistance money, but taking off some of the risks for private sector to enter into markets where they haven't been before. And we see, there are huge opportunities and so many things that we can do with limited public funding, but that can leverage so much private initiative.
Now, the relationship between development policy and the private sector is, of course, not a new topic. You know, there's been lots of efforts to figure out exactly how you can bring the two together, because as we know, the need for private sector development is very pressing across many African economies. I'm wondering, before we get further into the question of how you actually do that, you say that Africa is a focus, which in many ways makes sense. There are a lot of development challenges across the continent. Is the nature of the engagement with Africa also being impacted by this sort of picture of change that we're seeing globally? Economically, a lot of things are changing. Geopolitically, a lot of things are changing. And one of the dynamics, for example, that we've seen is that there's the emergence of many new partners that African economies are working with. Is that impacting the way Norway is engaging with the continent? Or perhaps do you see that maybe requiring a bit of an adaptation?
Well, the geopolitical context is dramatically changed just through, during the 2.5 years that I've been in office. But I would, from my point of view, our strategies are where they are. And of course, the context is challenging, but our priorities are very much the same. And I'd like to have to step back to a very interesting meeting that I attended in Nairobi last year, the pre-COP meeting in Nairobi before the climate summit in Dubai last year, where Kenya's President Ruto, had a very, very inspiring opening speech where he focused on the opportunities on the African continent. Because for me, as a Minister of International Development, I deal a lot with climate finance, a lot with development challenges, trying to find both the financial resources and all the other resources needed to deal with those problems that we know are enormous on the African continent. However, very often we focus on the problems, especially when we discuss climate change. And what I found so refreshing with his speech was that he said, yes, the African continent is possibly one of the continents that will be worst hit by climate change. We have contributed least to the problem. However, many of the opportunities to deal with the problem is also on our soils. Because if we invest in renewable energy and make sure that Africa can leapfrog from the dirty fossil fuels, don't have to pass by coal or diesel generators and go straight to renewable technology. That is a great investment in mitigation for the whole world. It is an investment in a global public good, as we say, but it's also investing in getting energy access to those millions and millions of people that still have not access to energy on the African continent. So it's a win-win. And another topic is food production. We know that we have to produce a lot more food for a growing population. On the African continent, foodstuff worth $75 billion is imported every year. While the resources are there, and with investments into climate smart technology and into processing along the value chain from a small-scale farmer to the market, not only can we avoid using hard-earned currency to import expensive food, but we can, invest in Africa becoming the breadbasket, not only for Africa, but for the world. And that is possible in a climate-smart manner. And there's a lot of focus on that at the moment, how we can produce more food for a growing global population while at the same time doing that in a more sustainable and climate-friendly manner. So the opportunities are immense. And it's not, it's not rocket science, it's not brain surgery. It's complicated and complex, yes, but we know what can be done to unleash these opportunities.
That's an excellent example, and I think the event you're referring to is the Africa Climate Summit, which was in September
Exactly.
in Nairobi. And you're absolutely right. President Ruto, he went out of his way to make that point that yes, climate change is a problem for Africa, but that doesn't mean we don't have any solutions and opportunities here. And that, of course, brings us into the area of narrative. And one of the challenges that many African economies face, many African countries face, is the narrative around Africa, which tends to focus on the problems, the negatives. Do you think that that narrative is changing in against the backdrop of a more complicated world? Let's put it that way. And examples like the Africa Climate Summit. Do you see that narrative changing? And what does that mean in terms of how you partner with Africa?
Well, I'd say yes and no. And of course, this is a vast continent, and the reality on the ground varies very much. But what I do believe is that we can do a lot from also the development assistance side to address that issue, because we know that the perceived risk for many businesses is higher than the actual risk of investing in many African countries. And so that is really sort of the wheel that I want to push, because if we are able to take some of the actual risk off and get small, medium-sized, and big Norwegian companies into the African market, that narrative will change with time.
Okay, so now we've now drifted into the question of investment and the private sector and the role of the private sector. You said earlier that in the world of development, as in many spheres these days, there is a bit of a funding squeeze, and of course across Africa, many economies are also contending with a bit of a funding squeeze. We have issues around debt sustainability. Many economies are still recovering from the COVID pandemic. Putting a cap on how much public financing is available, which is why private sector development, business development, and investment is such a key issue. You said earlier that one of the focus areas and priorities is understanding how you leverage in the private sector. Could you just delve a little bit deeper into that and maybe discuss some of the concrete tools or steps that can be taken or are being taken to drive more investment both ways, I presume, both from Norway and from Africa?
Great. There are many tools in our toolbox. One of the most well known is, of course, Norfund, which is the development investment fund of Norway, with great examples of leveraging and getting private investors on board. 2 years ago, we launched a new mechanism under Norfund called the Climate Investment Fund, which is specifically dealing with investments into renewable energy that will help unleash or remove some of the remove emissions of climate gas while introducing new projects that are renewable instead. And just a couple of days ago, we launched a new report of this fund, which states that just last year we invested in renewable energy projects in developing countries that equal to 1/6 of Norway's total emissions. And these are while still making money, so it's such a great, it's a win-win. Now that's one example. We also work with the World Bank and other investment bank with guarantee schemes. And a couple of years ago, I had the chance of visiting Baidoa in Somalia, up north in Somalia, close, to confrontations with Al-Shabaab and all, the horrific challenges that region is dealing with. And we visited a camp for internally displaced people close to Baidoa, where a Norwegian small renewable company was setting up a solar plant for electrifying or access to electricity for a new hospital for the internally displaced persons. And that was made possible because one of the guarantee schemes in the World Bank, MIGA, one of the windows there, took off financial risk, political risk for this company. And, they actually, they are on the ground in Baidoa, extremely challenging. I mean, it doesn't get a lot more challenging than that, I think, for a small Norwegian company. But they are there. They're putting up. I mean, it's amazing. One other example, just in this year's state budget, the government of Norway launched a new state guarantee mechanism. What that means is that we are really just using Norway's AAA rating in the financial market to make available cheaper financing for investments into renewable energy. So, it doesn't always have to come from the traditional ODA budget. We can use other mechanisms and guarantee schemes to just get financing in there, taking some risk off.
Is there the risk of a bit of tension there between the development imperative and the bottom line, the profit motive, so to speak? Presumably, this is something that has to be balanced. How do you balance those two things?
No, that's a great question, and it's something I'm very specific on when I discuss this with my team, because ODA funding, public official assistance funding, there are strict rules as to how that can be spent, and there are international rules in the OECD DAC that states how ODA can be spent. And one of those rules is, of course, it's not to be spent for promoting national exports. But we have many great mechanisms, institutions, tools in our toolbox for export financing and for facilitating Norwegian exports. But sometimes I get the feeling that, or not only a feeling, I have many concrete examples of how the toolbox that I have and the toolbox of the Minister of Industries, they don't speak to each other. So there's a missing link between the two, and we can easily address that, bridge the gap, without going on accord with the principles of ODA. So that is something that the government is looking into. I'm working on it with my colleague ministers to see, how can we just be smarter, making sure that Norwegian business don't get stuck in the middle when they have great technologies and ambitions that they want to test out in African countries, because I meet them all the time. Forward-leaning young entrepreneurs, great technologies that can make a huge difference for people and for development on the African continent, but they need just a little bit of help.
You've kind of touched on the next question, which is, where are some of the gaps? Where are some of the areas where you would like to see improvement? You've talked about one right now, work smarter. It sounds to me like, what you are describing to some extent is a holistic approach on the government level towards Africa. Is that a fair statement? Would you like to see more of that?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And the new Africa strategy that we are launching quite soon from our government is definitely a holistic approach. But we can do that. We can work smarter without compromising some very important principles of ODA, for example. We want, for me as Minister of Development, it's important to, we stick to the rules. We don't challenge the international rules on how this money is to be spent, but we can definitely bridge the gaps by just talking to each other. Sometimes I feel that we are so scared of just, exploring where the opportunities are, because we are we are concerned of doing something wrong, but there's definitely potential there, and it's all about talking to each other across
Yes.
the sectors.
Breaking out of silos can be
Yeah,
tricky,
it is. But
as we all
it
know.
comes from a good place, Lornbray. It comes from not, and Norwegians are very. We stick to the rules. We don't want to do anything wrong. We don't want to compromise any rules. But sometimes that takes that can be it becomes a hindrance. Because we also need to be flexible and smart, especially in the world today where we are desperate to get all hands on deck.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned the upcoming Africa strategy. Now, it hasn't been launched, so we unfortunately can't go into any of the details. But the timing of that seems to be quite appropriate. As you've just said, we need to be more dynamic. We need to be more responsive. We need to be able to adapt to this changing world. An interesting opportunity for Norway to sort of adapt its Africa strategy to this new context that we're in. Do you see this as an opportunity to kind of maybe reposition the relationship, kind of reframe it, and does it provide a basis, or could it provide a basis to take things to the next level, so to speak?
Hopefully, that's the idea, and in the changing context, the partnerships that we have with Africa will also have to change with new challenges globally and on the European and African continent. We need to develop our partnerships, and it is becoming more challenging. But I'd also like to say that we have a great starting point. The bilateral relations between Norway and so many African countries. It's so good. It's so solid, and it's built on trust. And I feel that when I meet my colleagues in African governments, Norway has we meet on a level very much trust based, and that's a great starting point for taking it up a notch.
All right. One final question for you today, Minister. Would you like to see, or let me put it this way, rather, what would you like to see happen in terms of the Norway-Africa relationship when it comes to development policy? What would you say maybe, one or two of the key priorities, the key areas that you would like to see develop and evolve in the coming years?
I'd like to see a lot more cooperation, especially with the private businesses on the great shared opportunities into especially food production and renewable energy, where I know that we have so much to discuss. While at the same time, Norway might provide or be a good dialogue partner for framework conditions, for institution building and capacity building in terms of how to create that whole ecology and the system that is good for not only business, but also for creating good lives for people across Africa.
All right, as good a note as any to end the conversation on. Minister Tvinnereim, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this morning. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you.